the number one thing that Levi sort of teaches, and to him it's like, if you can do this, then you can do magic, basically, and you don't really need a whole lot of other instruction or system, is to master the passions, as he calls it. And he calls that the great secret of occultism. It's basically ethics. And it's not even that he's necessarily saying that your ethics have to match a particular thing, although he very strongly intimates that. There's a lot of subtext in Levi, which I don't know if it's there necessarily because he believed it or because he didn't want to get in trouble, and I'm kind of very convinced that there are certain things that he says that you kind of read between the lines, and he's a little more out there than he would necessarily present himself to be, but he's trying to not get in trouble. Arthur Edmund Waite, who is the main translator of Levi, comments on this a couple of times, that he thinks that in Levi's early writings, it was before he was initiated into whatever mystery cult he was initiated into. Again, like, this is one of these details that we really don't have. And it was probably most likely a Martinist cult, because one of his compatriots, Pappus, or Gerardicus, who is a Gnostic saint in the Gnostic Mass, in Crowley's Gnostic Mass, he was definitely part of that. But most of their material was destroyed after the Nazis invaded France in World War II, so we kind of can't really check on that too closely, unfortunately. But the idea of mastering the passions is very much what Crowley comes up with later with calming the mind. And in Crowley's system, he uses yoga to do this a lot. In Levi's system, it's more just a matter of like not doing the things that excite you too much. You've got to have a calm mind. For Levi, that meant stepping back from the world. For Crowley, it meant stepping into the world. And in Crowley's system, it's kind of like, well, you master the passions by not getting excited about things, because you do everything until you're completely bored. Like, you have all the orgies, you do all the drugs, you do everything that you could possibly do to stimulate yourself until you just can't be stimulated anymore, and nothing will distract you from that point. Whereas Levi kind of goes in the opposite direction. And that's they're both legitimate. I mean, Crowley tells stories about this Russian Christian cult where they were very anti-sex. So their way of, and they cited a passage in the Bible which says that to think about having sex was the same as having sex in a sinful sort of way. So what they would do is just have a huge weekly orgy, so that everyone has sex and it's not in their minds anymore. They don't have to like think about it or get distracted by it. What this basically comes down to is very much the idea of karma. And karma is a very misused word, unfortunately. What it actually means is attachment. So it's whatever we attach to is what we have karma about. And it's not a good or a bad thing. There's no such thing as good or bad karma. It's all just attachment to the world. And what Levi's kind of trying to ask us to do, his great secret, is to detach everything. So that way one can perform any actions without having any kind of necessary investment in them. And Crowley comes up with this again later with the idea of the lust for result as the main problem in magic. It's like, if you do a ritual or you try to perform something and then you're just worried about how it's going to come out or what's going to happen with it, it screws up what you're trying to do, basically. So in a sense, that Thelema is the apotheosis of this idea of trying to detach oneself and master the passions, as Levi puts it. Levi also, I think one of the main differences between Levi's method and Crowley's method is Levi was very cynical about romantic relationships. He had 2 wives, both of whom left him at different points. And again, I'd love to have the details about that, but I really don't. There's a bunch of different apocryphal stories floating around out there, and none of them are really anything that you can confirm in any direct way. So essentially, like, to the other half of the mastering the passions thing is to be consistent in all of one's actions. And although I'm not a huge fan of Carlos Castaneda, I do think that there's one really good thing in his work where Don Juan tells him to be impeccable at all times. And impeccable essentially means that whatever the nature of the force that you're trying to invoke, you do not do anything that is contrary to that force. And as one progresses, ideally one wouldn't have any thoughts or have any experiences that would be contrary to that force. That's very difficult to accomplish in reality. That takes a lot of yoga and a lot of real serious work. Crowley came up with Liber Jugorum, which is a method of essentially, in his system, you cut yourself if you say a word that you're not supposed to say. You pick a word or an action or a thought or a letter. As you get more advanced, it gets more difficult. And that's the way of marking that you did the thing that you're not supposed to do. The idea is to acquire perfect control of this. This is very difficult. Like, this is amazingly difficult, especially when it comes to the idea of mastering the passions. And I strongly believe that Crowley got this idea from Levy's work. And we'll get to the specific magical reason why here in a second. But it comes to the old aphorism of, don't think, if you tell someone don't think of a white bear, then a white bear is all they can think about. This becomes difficult when you start doing Jagorum to actually control one's thought, because then it's on your mind all the time. Same as not saying a word. Well, it's on your mind all the time, so you're going to say it. And getting to this magical reason for this consistency in behavior and consistency in comportment, Levy was very influenced by Anton Mesmer, and he was a guy who, that's where we get the term mesmerism. He came up with the idea of animal magnetism, the idea being that there were certain magnetic currents that ran between human beings, and he had magnetic therapy where he would run his hands over someone's body and try to generate energies through his hands that would do or undo the problems that the person was having. Now, there are problems with Mesmer's work, and there are problems with his theory. He tends to be discredited as a bit of a quack. I don't think that this is incredible. This is really does him justice. Mainly because he was a pioneer in his field. He was pretty much the first person to seriously expound this idea. And it tends to be the case. It's like when people like to make fun of Freud for his theories or his ideas. It's like, well, he came up with psychoanalysis. So yeah, he's going to be wrong about some things. He's the first person to come up with the idea. The first person to do, the pioneer in the field is always going to make some mistakes. Yeah, Mesmer made mistakes. But that doesn't mean that the theory behind what he's saying doesn't have some validity to it. In a sense, and Levy's not talking about necessarily what Mesmer was doing, but he definitely was influenced by the idea of the push and pull of the universe. In a sense, what he sort of explains what you're trying to do when you do a ceremonial magical ritual is to create a vacuum in the universe, a space for a thing to happen. And there is, and I am going to try to emphasize this term because I like to make up terms, is causal suction. Creating this vacuum of causality means that something has to appear to fill it up. This idea is sort of where he came up with the concept of the astral light, which we'll return to briefly. But this was very strongly grounded in theories in physics at the time that were very popular. At the time, most physicians didn't have the idea of gravity like we have it today. They called it the aether, with the idea that all planets are floating in this sort of mystical force. And this idea kind of got replaced later by Einstein and other thinkers like him, and sort of got turned on its head. But when Levy was, and it may not be the best theory for physics, and it may not even be the best theory for magic, but that's what Levy was grounding this in. And again, we're going to come back to that. Levy really wanted people to think critically about these magical ideas. He was this is why he's kind of bringing scientific theories into the equation, because he was very critical of not just the current in the priesthood, like I was talking about before, where people would just pay off priests to curse their neighbors or whatever because they were pissed off. But he was also critical of the whole spiritualist situation that was happening at the time, because he was writing at the time where this was just kind of kicking off. And when Crowley's writing many years later is when it was in full force with Helena Blavatsky and this whole Theosophist movement. And Crowley hated those people just as much as Levy hated the spiritualists of his time. What he referred to evocation and invocation as is a form of controlled madness, and he considered it to be very dangerous because there was no way of sort of regulating the information people got.